Just before we get started, I'd like to give a quick plug for a new channel that I've started. It's called Biographics, where we look at biographies of famous people from history as well as the present day. It's not all politics, although we have done some politics. We've looked at Vladimir Putin as well as Arnold Schwarzenegger. I know he definitely covers both fields, but please do go check it out. There is a link in the description below. Alright, so you probably know Peter Thiel.
I build companies and I support people who are building new things.
He was one of the founders of PayPal, the first investor of Facebook, and he's one of the most important technology and venture capital gurus in the world. He's obviously a multi-billionaire, and he's also a bit of a peculiar guy. For instance, he financed projects like the Sea Standing Institute, an organization aimed at being a politically autonomous floating city, and he's also funded anti-aging research by using the blood of young people. Peter Thiel is also known for being the biggest supporter of Donald Trump in Silicon Valley, although in some conversations with journalists recently, he's already shown some concerns. And, I mean, what the hell, all of us have the right to be wrong sometimes. The thing is that in 2011, Peter Thiel was granted New Zealand citizenship, and on his application, he said this.
I'm happy to say, categorically, that I've found no other country that aligns more with my view of the future than New Zealand.
The truth is that this is probably no surprise to regular viewers of VisualPolitik. We've already said in 2 other videos how much we love this country. And not just for its beauty, although New Zealand is one of the most beautiful countries in the world. They're also an example to be followed. Take a look at the statements of former Prime Minister Bill English about his predecessor.
Occasionally, John Key would come home and complain that he was the only one who didn't have a jet, and how his colleagues were horrified to find that he, as a world leader, had to travel on commercial aircraft. But I assured him that it was character building and kept him in touch with normal people. Bill English.
No, New Zealand doesn't have an Air Force One of their own, but it is one of the easiest countries to do business in. And as we've already seen, it's one of the most prosperous, least corrupt, and safest countries on the planet. And let's add to that their first-rate public services, their ranking as one of the countries with the highest standards of living, and as well as having one of the lowest employment rates. Just take a look at this chart. However, they weren't always like this.
The sun didn't always rise.
There's no doubt that New Zealand is a top-rate country. But things weren't always like that. Definitely not at all in fact. What we are going to see now is a real story. The story of a country that was determined to learn from its mistakes, to transform everything that didn't work, and by doing so, become an international role model. And, well, this is definitely not the norm. Placing people first before any kind of ideology and electoral interests, it's not so common, at least not in most countries, but let's see what happened. Well, the first thing we have to say is that New Zealand was always a relatively wealthy country. In fact, by the late 1950s, this country had the 3rd highest per capita income in the world, which is certainly not bad, right? However, just wait a moment, because that's the moment when things started to get a bit worse. Bad enough, in fact, that by 1984, the per capita income was similar to that of Portugal or Turkey. So, well, now you're probably wondering, well, what on earth happened for New Zealand to drop so far? Well, it could be said that the government, they went a bit too far. By that time, the government of New Zealand had meddled with the economy to such an extent that it's hard to even imagine what it was like. There were many taxes, most of them incredibly complex, and most of them really high. Just so you can get an idea of that, the highest income tax rate was almost 70%, and the lowest was still 40%. And companies, well, they didn't get any better treatment. The profit tax was 48%, which is twice as much as the world's average nowadays. And on top of all of that, there were tons of regulations. There were price controls for almost any product, currency controls, and that's just scratching the surface. As an example, any import required the approval of the administration, and it was really hard for New Zealanders to invest their money outside of the country.
We had foreign exchange controls that meant I couldn't buy a subscription to The Economist magazine without the permission of the Minister of Finance. Maurice P. McTeague, former Minister of the Government of New Zealand.
Look, the controls and regulations, they didn't just establish minimum wages, they also set caps for the maximum. Yep, you heard that absolutely right. Let's say that a business owner wanted to pay a bonus to his workers. Well, that wasn't an easy task. And as you can imagine, the state owned and controlled almost every large national company. Media, airlines, insurance companies, banks, even hotels. Yet the government was really managing hotels, not joking here. So in other words, the early 1980s New Zealand was the very example of extreme statism. In one way or another, almost everything was controlled by bureaucrats and politicians. And so, well, what were the consequences of all this? Well, they weren't exactly positive. After 23 years of deficit in the government's balance, public debt had absolutely skyrocketed. There was two-figure unemployment, private investors were pulling out of the country, and the Kiwi youth, well, they were fleeing in huge numbers. By that time, doing business in New Zealand, it was an enormously complicated process, and to be honest, it was only attempted by the bravest. However, everything started to change in 1984 when elections took place.
A plan to move forward.
In 1984, in the midst of a tough crisis, elections were celebrated. The winner was David Lange of the Centre-Left Party.
This nation is at risk. That is how basic it is.
The new government, they had a purpose: to overcome the crisis and to change the national model. They had to replace everything that didn't work and make sure they did it without leaving anybody behind, while at the same time granting the opportunities for others to move forward. So even though David Lange was the Prime Minister, the leader of this whole process was the Minister of Finance, and that was Sir Roger Douglas. In fact, the process is named after him. It's known as Rogernomics.
We went probably from being the most regulated in the developed world to the least regulated.
We actually discussed this in a previous video where we talked about the agricultural reforms that have been so successful in New Zealand. Roger Douglas started an ambitious reform program known as Rogernomics. In this program, many areas of the economy were liberalized, and this included the primary sector. And these changes, they took place almost overnight. Price controls were eliminated and most farming subsidies were removed. But Rogernomics, it wasn't just about agriculture. The plan affected almost every aspect of the state and created a new political culture. In fact, by the time the Rights International Party won the elections in 1990 and took power again, everything had changed and the new government followed the Labour process. Rogernomics, it was a political philosophy that radically changed the country between the year 1984 and the beginnings of the 21st century. The first thing that the government did was declare a war on bureaucracy. They did it in three ways. First, they did a thorough analysis of every governmental department. If what they did was not essential or could be better done by the market, well, that was the end of it. Following the same pattern, they started an ambitious plan of privatization. I mean, think about it. What was the state doing wasting time managing hotels, airlines, or telecommunications? Thanks to competition, the market could do a much better job and with less cost and more innovation.
I come at it from an angle of what's good for the consumer. The provider, I don't care fundamentally who the provider might be. It might be a public institution, it could be a private institution, so long as it serves the consumer or the taxpayer. That's where I come from.
Second, of the 35 remaining public agencies, the government made management work under market conditions. This was the case for air traffic controllers, for instance. And the results, they were totally terrific. Not only did the services of these public agencies improve, they went from costing the government $1 billion every year to generating, with taxes and profits, more than $1 billion. This is money that could then be put into things like education, healthcare, and culture. But that wasn't the end of it. Since regulations and laws were numerous and complex, the government decided to work towards an important goal, and that was the simplification and elimination of any laws that they deemed unnecessary. And so, what was the result of all of these changes?
When we started this process with the Department of Transportation, it had 5,600 employees. When we finished, it had 53. When we started with the Forest Service, it had 17,000 employees. When we finished, it had 17. Maurice P. McTeague.
And unemployment, it didn't increase. it was reduced. So there's this very illustrative story, and it actually involves deer as in the animals. So when the British arrived in New Zealand, the country didn't have any large animals, so the wealthy families, they imported deer for hunting. And, well, can you guess what happened? These deers, they spread rapidly, forming massive herds that caused critical ecological damage by overgrazing. For 120 years, the state had spent a lot of money trying to fight this plague in order to preserve the local ecosystem. Well, one day they came up with a new idea. Why couldn't they let farmers hunt and raise the deer? And, well, that's exactly what they did. Not only did this put an end to the plague, New Zealand today is the world's largest supplier of deer meat. And all of this, it really does make sense. And it's also interesting to see what happened to taxes, which were simplified and reduced. Many were surprised by the results. Tax collection actually increased by 20%. And further, subsidization, it was cut, not only in agriculture, but also in industry sectors. But there was much more than just economic reform here. The reforms reached the public services. And take a look at what happened with education, for instance. The education budget of New Zealand, it hadn't stopped growing for years, but the results, they were just getting worse and worse. So the question was, well, are Kiwi students getting more stupid? And that didn't really seem likely. So when the government analysed the causes, they realised that an important share of the budget was not actually being spent on education, but on administration. These were quality evaluation agencies, rating firms, dossier agencies, and so on. So, what did the government decide to do? Well, they simply removed it all, and they gave the schools control with a management board chosen by the parents. Also, they allowed parents to choose schools freely, private or public, and the government would pay for it. And, well, what we can tell you now is that education results improved significantly. And, well, the same thing, it happens with everything else. New Zealand today, it's a prosperous country with a very high standard of living and whose public services, education, health and culture are among the best in the world. So that leaves us thinking that New Zealand, it's an amazing example for countries in Latin America or some European countries like Spain, Italy, Greece and Portugal. Well, if anything is for certain, it's that the land of Kiwis is a great country. And now it's your turn. Do you think that New Zealand makes a good model to be followed? Well, please do leave your answer in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you, and also in this survey. I also really hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit like if you did, and do not forget to subscribe to our channel for brand new videos every Monday and Thursday. Also, please do go check out my new channel. It's called Biographics. We also do videos on Mondays and Thursdays. Those are great days for YouTube. It's biographies of people from history. Link in the description below. And as always, thank you for watching.